Determining whether or not an expression or an equation is a function is kind of one of the big questions of algebras. Whether or not something is working correctly. And that's kind of the way I define it for my students is this functioning the way we want it to? So the example that I give is I give them the idea of, imagine that we're looking at some type of a soda machine, and I'm basically putting in my coins into this slot, and I'm picking what kind of soda I want. Okay, so I've got, maybe let's say I have Pepsi here, I have Dr. Pepper here, and let's say I have water. Okay, what I want to know is, when I push these buttons, when I push the button that says Pepsi, will I get a Pepsi, and will I get it every single time I get it? Meaning, will I always get a Pepsi out, or does something different come out? Will I push that, and randomly a water pops out of the machine? If I push that and a water came out, it's not functioning correctly, right? But if it comes out where I get my soda, I know that this is working and everything's okay. So what I want to know is, based on my input, whatever button I push, do I get the expected output? Okay, do I get what I expected the machine to give me? If I do, this is functioning correctly. If I don't, this machine doesn't work. It's not functioning. So let's look at what that looks like with numbers, because I think that's a big concept for people to understand. Is we're only looking at our input and our output. That's really what we're looking at for these machines to know if they're working correctly. And I'm going to give you the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to give you this list of outputs that are 5, 10, 15, 20. Could be anything we want, but here's what I tell you. I push the number 1, and every time I push it, I get a 5. I push the number 2. Every time I get a 10. The number 3, every time I get a 15. And the 4, every time I get a 20. Is this functioning correctly? Is this a function? And the answer is yes. It works correctly. Every time I push that 1, I'm going to get a 5 out. Okay? So let's look at another example. Let's look at another example of this. Here's my input. Here's my output. I look at my little list. I'm going to go ahead and give you similar values. So I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4. And over here, I've got a 5. So I push the 1, and I get a 5. Every time I push that 1, I get a number 5. I push the 2, I get a 5. I push the number 3, and I get a 5. And I push the 4, and I get a 5. Now every time I push those numbers, that's the answer I get out. I get a 5. Does that mean the machine is broken? No, maybe the only thing in that machine is the number 5, correct? So I'm not pushing 1 and getting something different. I'm getting the number 5 when I do it. So is this functioning correctly? Yes, this is functioning correctly. Now let's look at an example where our machine basically is broken. So here's our input. Here's our output. We give you our same choices. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are our buttons. On this side, I give you my numbers that are coming out. So I've got 5, 10, 15, 20. I push the number 1. I get a 5. Every time I push it, 5 comes out. I push the 2, and I get a 10. I push the 3, and I get a 15, or sometimes I get a 5. And I push the 4, and I get a 20. So my question then is this functioning correctly? Well, what does this tell me right here? Well, the number 3 has two different outputs. I don't know what I'm going to get. Sometimes I'll get a 15. Sometimes I'll get a 5. I don't know if I'm going to get 10 5s in a row and then a 15. I don't know how that's going to work. But because that number goes to two different values, the answer for this one is this functioning? The answer is no. This is not functioning correctly because the 3, when I push that 3, I could get a 5 or I could get a 15. And because I don't know it's going to work every time, I'm not going to get what I want, this machine is now broken and therefore it is not a function.